SBC Media.
Welcome to the iGaming Daily Podcast, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market.
Skill, chance, fantasy, sports betting. These words have been repeated ad nauseum for the past week as the opinion on daily fantasy sports from California AG Rob Bonta's office turned the entire industry on its head. There were plenty of fireworks in advance of the 4th of July, and we're breaking down everything you need to know about California DFS on today's episode of iGaming Daily. iGaming Daily is brought to you by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. I am Jessica Welman, managing editor of SBC Media, joined by senior journalist and Canadian gaming business editor Tom Nightingale, who had to deal with me being off while California exploded last week. Although I will say I was in line for roller coasters at an amusement park texting with you about this because it was just such a big deal.
It's very apt, isn't it, that you were about to board a roller coaster
yes.
as all of this was going on.
That is a good metaphor that I hadn't really realized. So let's just rewind. Where did this whole thing begin?
I think we're going back easily a decade plus, aren't we, if you're looking at the full context.
Oh, man.
When there's an assembly member, I think when Kamala Harris was Attorney General, right?
Well, I don't know if they actually made the request. When a lawmaker makes the request, they are kind of required to do it. I don't know if there was an actual request under Harris, was there?
Right, I don't know, but there was certainly comments from an assembly member who, it was of the opinion that fantasy sports betting wasn't legal. I know that Harris, we didn't get a comment on the issue or anything like that. And then there have been several statements, haven't there, over time. It's always been one of those issues that I think has kind of been bubbling under for a while. And then was it 2023 that Senator Scott Wilk, I think his name was, did send a letter to the Department of Justice, I think, requesting the legal opinion on it, asserting that it's games of chance, not permitted, under state law. And then that, I think, right, is when Bonta began sort of properly assessing or investigating. And then here we are, 2 years.
It's finally here. Yeah, so we got word last week that it was coming, and it was coming before July 3rd, which then we kind of got word what was in it, which was not ideal either. What was in it was going to be a very sweeping conclusion that basically all of this is not okay. And then in the interim, and I'm going to take a little credit, SBC Americas was the first to report that we learned that Underdog was trying to intervene through a California court to get the opinion shut down. Can't release the opinion. It will be a detriment to our business. It will lead our customer base to potentially leave without, clarity on what our status is. They will use this to try to push us out of the state. We've had conversations with the AG that says as much. And Tom, you kind of reported on why the judge denied this request. What was the rationale behind saying, no, we're not going to stop the Attorney General of California's office from putting this opinion out?
Yeah, well, so I think Judge Rockwell, the crux of the argument seemed to be that Underdog had ample opportunity, I think was the phrase used, to raise this concern, because obviously, as we discussed, Senator Scott Wilk wrote to Bonta, and Bonta started investigating. I think it's been more than 18 months since he was asked to start investigating the legality of DFS. So I think a large part of the judge's reasoning was, well, if you had 18 months, you sort of left this to the last minute to file these concerns, and I think it was just found that that didn't constitute a basis for the relief. And there was also a suggestion, I think, from the judge that Underdog hadn't adequately established that it would suffer significant harm or something as a result of just the opinion itself being issued, because, as I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, the opinion, obviously, as we know, isn't an actual legal decision. It is very much what it says on the tin. It's the Attorney General's opinion of where the legal status should fall. It doesn't actually change any laws. And as we also probably will talk about, it doesn't mean that Underdog, as of right now, have to stop offering DFS in California. So I think based on all these factors, the judge thought there's not really a basis for...
Yeah, I mean, the most interesting piece is we've written quite a bit about Louisiana, Michigan, some of these other states that have AG involvement in sending these cease and desists. And a lot of people who are against unregulated gaming in general sing it from the rooftops as like the law of the land. And it's like, as Tom put in a header in one of our stories, that's just like your opinion, man. So yeah, it is just an opinion. And the judge was like, this isn't going to change anything because it doesn't change the law in any way, shape, or form. The law is still the law. I didn't really explain what was in the Underdog case, but it's important to kind of run down their argument just because if someone does start enforcing this, there could be a court challenge from an operator down the way that's going to make the similar kinds of debate, which is, one, that the scope of the question was not something an AG should be answering. AG questions by nature need to just kind of answer a legal question based on the principles of the law. They can't be a fact-finding mission. And over the course of the 18 months, the AG's office talked with a bunch of operators about all sorts of different verticals. So Underdog's argument was like, look, they're out finding facts. Like, this is a fact-finding mission. The other thing that does kind of conflict with the timeline is that Wilkes, the senator who asked for this, got term limited out of office last year. So in theory, the argument that Underdog is making, you shouldn't answer this because he is no longer a lawmaker who needs this kind of clarity to do his job because it's not his job anymore. So I think those two things might come up in the future as potential issues. We'll see. In the meantime, the opinion dropped, and hoo boy, it was not pretty.
No, I mean, it wasn't, was it? We had an inkling that this was the kind of thing that would be coming down, but I mean, it seems to be very. I mean, to say that no version of DFS is in compliance with state law is, I think, to me, seems quite a big statement in itself, given that there is so much debate over even what constitutes fantasy contests and fantasy sports themselves. Like when that sort of grey area exists, even almost within the vertical itself, to come out and say, no, the entire vertical is in compliance almost before it's been sort of, well, some people would argue before it's even been adequately defined, is quite the statement, I think. It was very interesting. I mean, Jess probably won't plug herself, so I will. The explainer that Jess wrote for SBC Americas on this opinion, very good. If you haven't read it, recommend that you read it, because it goes through different categories of DFS. You know, obviously we've got sort of against the house pick'em, which I think is one of the more understandable arguments about daily fantasy sports resembling sports wagering, because you can look at that and suggest that it does look quite a lot like parlays and that sort of stuff. And then what was really interesting to me was that peer-to-peer pick'em barely got a mention.
That was funny too. You know what? Let's take a couple minutes and go. I agree. Go read the explainer for the full thing, but we'll run it down here a bit. First, we say Rob Bonta. That's because the Attorney General is Rob Bonta and it is his office. Technically, the author of this opinion is actually one of the deputy AGs, Karim Kentfield. So know that it's not the Rob Bonta who wrote this. His point was that largely, if you look at Penal Code Section 337A, there's really no exemption or mention of skill at all, which has been the crux of a lot of DFS debates, that there is a skill element to figuring out how to fine-tune a lineup and beat other people by doing that activity better than them. The same way, you know, Joey Chestnut wins the hot dog eating contest by eating more hot dogs than everyone else. He also kind of rejected the idea that these are contests instead of wagering. And his source on this was kind of fascinating. He took the dissenting opinion of the New York court case that determined fantasy was a skill game. And rather than take the court ruling, he took the dissenting opinion's note that the only thing you've developed a skill for is a skill for wagering. So it's wagering. And that was kind of his framework of how he approached this. So, yeah, kind of bit by bit. Pick'em Fantasy, he just was like, this is a parlay. Very flatly said that there was nothing about this to him that thought skill games applied. And that the argument that result of a sporting event is the final score of the game itself, to him, was too narrow an interpretation, and that the statistics that a player accumulates over the course of a game are the result of a sporting event as well. So a very broad definition of result is another reason why he kind of landed this way. Peer-to-peer pick'em, it was in a footnote. Like, that's it. A single footnote. What has been the fix for how many states, Tom? 7 or 8, at least.
Yeah. I don't know how many. Yeah.
Like, at least half a dozen states have been like, you do it peer-to-peer, you're fine. He just addresses in a footnote. We are told that some operators offer pick'em as a peer-to-peer competition. In our view, this version of pick'em also constitutes sports wagering because the entry fees satisfy the definition of a bet or wager. What I think nobody saw coming was that the old school lineup draft style fantasy is no longer on the table. So those contests that you enter on DraftKings and FanDuel that were all the rage 10 years ago, to him, as I mentioned, while you may try to argue that this is a contest the same way you can win money in a bowling tournament or, you know, at a trivia league, to him, it's still equated to gambling. What doesn't get discussed in this is season-long fantasy leagues like I'm in with my friends. The reason they didn't get discussed was purely technical, which is that the question specifically said daily fantasy sports. However, I'm reading this argument and I don't know what the aspect of stretching this out to the entire football season really does to fundamentally change any of it. Do I think there is an appetite to go after like people's long-standing high school friends fantasy football league? No, but the door is kind of open for that if this opinion is enforceable in any way, shape, or form. So that's something to definitely keep an eye out on.
Don't you then have the issue, the question of where do you draw the line in that regard? You know, I'm not a fantasy sports player, but if you are, like you say, leaving the door open to those season-long, you know, those kind of season-long contests, where do you sort of, I guess the question becomes, where do you draw the line? And I mean, what I was thinking while you were talking and while you were going through this is, again, you know, the key word is opinion, isn't it, really, in this, I think, at the moment.
Well, I mean, the product that's going to be really interesting to me is that Underdog in particular has a draft product where it's like what's called a best ball format. For those who don't know, you don't set the lineup the way you do in your regular fantasy league, but you do have a draft like you do in a regular fantasy league. And then for all of the players that you have, it just takes the highest scores from whatever position each week. So it's season long. It's not daily. So does it just not get touched, period? I don't know. But that kind of muddies the waters for all the rest of this, too. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we've broken down the opinion, but we're going to talk about what the reaction is and what we can expect next.
SBC Leaders connects the gambling industry's top-tier operators and associations to share the best ideas, collaborate on solving the biggest issues, and push innovation throughout the betting and gaming industry. If you're an operator and want to join the discussion, visit sbcleaders.com for more information.
Welcome back to iGaming Daily as we try to unpack all of this stuff from California. If my breakdown on the California AG opinion wasn't long enough, the ever-growing list of people that responded to this made it even longer. But I think you gotta go with the headliner, which is that Governor Gavin Newsom's office just came out right away. I'm talking within 10 minutes.
It was very quick, wasn't it?
They were ready with a statement. The Attorney General, in his independent capacity, issued this opinion, not the governor's office. While the governor does not agree with the outcome, he welcomes a constructive path forward in collaboration with all stakeholders. This was also a point Underdog made in its attempt to stop this was, we don't even know why this senator is asking this question, because when it comes to like enforcement of law, that is the executive branch, and that's Gavin Newsom's business, not yours. So we don't even know why you need to care. That the fact that he does not agree with this is the glimmer of hope, I think, for fantasy operators. But maybe I'm looking for something optimistic out of here.
Well, I mean, it was no surprise to see that cited, wasn't it? I think it was the Coalition for Fantasy Sports. Their statement, I think, opens with the words, "We agree with Governor Newsom." Attorney General Bonta got it wrong. I mean, to your point, when you have the governor coming out and saying this, it doesn't exactly clear up the rather muddied waters, does it? When you have the Attorney General and the governor within minutes of one another pretty much saying different things. And then, of course, like if you're a fantasy operator or you're a coalition of fantasy operators, you're what the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association, I think, also released a statement, or you're somebody like Underdog or DraftKings, if the governor is immediately saying, well, hang on a second, obviously as an operator, you're going to say, well, he said, hang on a second. And you end up in this situation, I think, now where I know we're going to talk about what we think happens next. I wouldn't like to be putting money on what happens next, but you know, you feel like it's a long way from over, really, because you mentioned at the start of this about the idea of more court cases coming, and in this situation where the Attorney General has said one thing and it's an opinion, and the governor has basically said another thing, you'd have to say that may embolden operators to challenge this in the court, because clearly, even at the highest levels within the state, there isn't a consensus.
Well, and to your point, nobody left.
Yes.
Nobody has announced plans of leaving. Nobody has left. And from my understanding, nobody is going to announce that they're leaving in the wake of this, because as the judge pointed out, and that is the person who makes these rulings, this isn't enforceable. You can't do anything with this. So the part that was super interesting to me was the very different reactions of FanDuel and DraftKings to this, because I think we've mentioned on the pod before, these are two groups looking to stay on the good side of the tribal gaming organizations and have done a so-so job at doing that, given some of the hiccups that they had. You know, CNIGA, the California Nations Indian Gaming Association, they went, with their own release talking about how clear it is. Thank God somebody's finally doing something. And you run the risk of kind of pissing some people off if you stick around. And FanDuel is like, we look forward to talking to the AG. We'll see what we can figure out. DraftKings came out hard. DraftKings respectfully disagrees with the interpretation expressed with respect to peer-to-peer fantasy sports contests in the non-binding advisory opinion issued by the Attorney General of California. We believe peer-to-peer fantasy contests, including salary cap, pause for emphasis, pick six, and best ball are legal in California, and we intend to continue offering them as we have done without challenge for over 13 years. Notably, the overwhelming body of law from 24 states in Congress confirms that fantasy sports are legal games of skill, et cetera, et cetera. To the people, FSGA made a similar point. I will point out the law state to state varies greatly on games of skill, games of chance, and that sort of thing. That, it is not abnormal for one state to think this is not okay when others do. Look at Washington and all of the sweepstakes gaming. So I don't know how persuasive that piece of it is. But the same group that has so actively decried peer-to-peer or against the house fantasy that Underdog and Prize Picks were offering, and then they pivoted to a peer-to-peer system only for DraftKings to launch their own Pick 6, is now saying these things that they claim are very obviously parlays are in fact legal games of skill, which is an interesting reversal, of course.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I mean, it's yeah. To your point about the state law varying so much as well, it comes back, I think a lot of it comes down to, does anybody really know either how this is defined or, I think a lot of, for lawmakers, and not just lawmakers, but attorney generals and governors of states who are looking into this, like, do they even know how they want this vertical to be defined? Because until you have that kind of, and obviously it's going to vary state by state, but until you have that kind of firm hand and you know what you're looking to get out of this kind of review of the vertical, then you're always going to have this toing and froing and this uncertainty. Like, if you're an operator, I understand in certain situations why you would sort of, I guess, push back against this, because there is no, it's that lack of legal clarity. Why is it incumbent upon you to stop offering things just because an attorney general makes a sweeping kind of statement about their status?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people kind of point to the UIGEA carve out for fantasy, and it's like, that's a federal law about banking. It's not state law. There's just not really anything on the books in California that even mentions fantasy. So there's no realm to even define it by, other than a close reading of Penal Code 337A, which I unfortunately did. That does kind of open the door for a potential interpretation this way. I think if I'm the DFS community and you can end up being okay doing this as long as it's peer-to-peer, which we saw Prize Picks switch to peer-to-peer in California before the opinion came down, that maybe this is the compromise you try to reach that everyone feels okay about. And we will see where it goes from there. So I think next steps, you're going to have some meetings. I think with Gavin Newsom's involvement, it certainly is higher priority than you may realize. And then we've also got, tomorrow in our time, not in podcast time, but on Tuesday of this week, there's a sweepstakes hearing on the sweepstakes bill that potentially impacts some of this to a certain degree too. They could throw in fantasy language or something like that in an amendment if they are concerned that the way it's written isn't enforceable. With all of that in mind, there's a lot to keep tabs on, and you should keep checking out SBC Americas every day as we do cover all of this as quickly as it is happening. Check out what's happening with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act has upended gambling taxation. It's been a crazy 10 days. I don't know how to sit up straight or stay awake because I feel like all we do is read and report on this. So check it out. Check out our efforts and make it feel worthwhile that I barely sleep anymore. Tom, anything to add to that? Anything people need to check out on the network?
I would say we certainly do our best, don't we, to keep up with things in real time. But
it's tough these days, though.
Yeah, and what we've learned is that if you go to a theme park, take your technology with you.
I did have my laptop stored in a locker just in case.
There we go.
And it's that kind of dedication that keeps you coming to the SBC Network and back to iGaming Daily every day for a new episode with all the latest headlines from the international gambling space.
Thank you for listening to today's iGaming Daily podcast, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News network or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.